We awoke to sunshine and drove south from the Otago Peninsula heading for our evening destination, Stewart Island. We took the southern scenic route through the Catlins, a lesser visited area of the country, at least for foreigners, but a beautiful drive through pastures, rolling hills, streams and finally coastline. We stopped in Curio Bay to visit the ancient petrified forest dating back to the Jurassic period. It is best seen as it becomes exposed at low tide. We also visited their living forest restoration project. The weather was deteriorating as we drove to Cliff, at the southern tip of the South Island, where we parked the camper and took the last ferry for the day to Stewart Island. Our time on the island was to be less than 24 hours, and started as soon as we arrived, as we met our guide and went out, in the pouring rain, to find kiwi. It worked this time. We stood in the rain mesmerized as this brown kiwi just fed and ran around in some guy's front yard. One of the birding highlights of our lives. We returned to the hotel that was the only open hotel and restaurant this late in the season. The next morning we walked over to the other side of the island and took the water taxi over to Ulva Island. Ulva is no longer inhabited full-time, and is another protected area for native plants and animals to recover. It was like going back in time, with the antediluvian forests full of rare and endemic plants and birds. Our guide was a local. Only about 300 people live on Stewart Island full-time, and most now are in tourism, instead of fishing. She, and our guide from the night before, both spoke with Scottish brogues, the people there are of Scottish ancestry, and have been as isolated as the kiwi. We left Stewart Island on the 3 p.m. ferry and pushed as hard as we could to get as close to Milford Sound as possible, but the darkness and the return of heavy rain made us stop in Taianau.
The morning brought the end of the rain, so we headed into the Fiordland National Park, driving through the beautiful valley, then up and over the mountains, through the tunnel, ending at Milford Sound. We had chosen a smaller boat to see the sound, and it was a good idea, since even at the cusp of winter, the crowds were amazing. The weather held, and even broke into some sun for us at times. Enjoy the majestic wonder and beauty of Milford Sound.
We returned by the same road, only to discover the snow line had lowered as we traveled through the tunnel, which has quite the incline. We exited the tunnel at the summit to snow. The snow disappeared as we made the descent to Teanau, and we headed towards Kingston as a starting point for our drive through the Southern Alps. About an hour east of Teanau, we were hit by a sudden snowstorm that quickly made the roads impassable. About 4 hours later, the highway department finally plowed and pulled people out of the snow, and we stopped at the first Freedom camping spot we could find.
The morning of our last full day started in Lumsden, an old rail town that luckily had a camping area in its park. We drank enough coffee to make up for the short night and headed out. We drove to Kingston, which is the base of a large lake. At the northern end is Queenstown. We drove the road called the Devil's Staircase to Queenstown for a coffee break, then headed north. As we drove, the weather got better and better, the skies breaking and the sun coming out, just in time to illuminate our way through the mountains and gorges of the Remarkables Range. We stopped for photos, along with dozens of camper-clad Chinese tourists, at the Lindy's Pass with its dusting of snow. After getting though the pass, the Southern Alps loomed before us as we enjoyed the relentless beauty out every window.
Our penultimate stop was Lake Pulaski, where we drove the road to see if we could be lucky to photograph Mount Cook, the highest peak in New Zealand. The weather gods were kind, and we stopped time and time again as we drove toward it, stopping to take another of the most famous travel photos. Such a day with Gamutlakite at the base of the lake, then headed to our final camping spot. Lake Taupo. Known as one of the dark sky reserves, we hoped for one last Milky Way shot, but the passing clouds canceled that idea. Instead, we sat with our wine and watched the sun set on our last day. We awoke to watch the sunrise over the lake, a quiet and contemplative time for us to just review and remember the amazing places, people and animals we had seen over this trip. We are truly fortunate and lucky to witness all this wonder of the world. We cleaned and packed the camper, then turned it in at the Christchurch airport, flying to Auckland where we met our early morning flight first to Sydney, then another long flight to Los Angeles, and finally our flight home.